For most of human history, nobody climbed a mountain because the view was beautiful. Mountains were where you got lost, froze, hunted, prayed, or tried to cross before dark. European writers described the Alps as ugly and frightening. The idea of walking uphill for hours, reaching the top, and coming back with nothing except a view is only about 300 years old. Then one poet claimed he had done exactly that. After him came tourist trails, national parks, climbing clubs, and millions of people walking into places their ancestors avoided. The mountains did not become safer. We simply changed the reason for entering them. And the danger never left. In these mountains, a 5,000-year-old man was murdered. On another summit, a professor ran 4 miles from something he could not see. And in the Urals, 9 trained hikers cut their way out of a tent and walked barefoot into a winter night. The story starts with a climb that may never have happened. On April 26, 1336, the Italian poet Francesco Petrarca, better known as Petrarch, climbed Mont Ventoux in southern France. The mountain is about 6,200 feet high. It is not an extreme climb by modern standards. But Petrarch's reason for going was unusual. He later wrote that he climbed simply to see what such a height looked like. Not to hunt, not to trade, not to cross a pass, just to stand at the top and look. That letter is often treated as the birth certificate of hiking. Petrarch is called the first person in the Western world to climb a mountain for pleasure. The problem is that the claim is probably too neat. The philosopher Jean Buridan may have climbed Mont Ventoux before Petrarch, possibly to observe the weather. Peter III of Aragon claimed a high Pyrenean summit in 1275. Medieval people climbed mountains for religion, surveying, hunting, mining, and war. They were not waiting for Petrarch to invent the act of walking uphill. Some historians even suspect Petrarch wrote the letter years later as an allegory. The mountain may have represented the difficulty of reaching spiritual truth, not an actual day out. So the first famous hiking story may be a story about a hike that never happened. But Petrarch's letter still mattered. It helped create a new way of describing height. A mountain could be frightening and beautiful at the same time. The view could be the purpose. For centuries, that idea spread slowly. Most people still had practical reasons to be in high country. Shepherds, miners, soldiers, pilgrims, and hunters went where work or faith took them. The mountains were not empty. They were simply not being visited by choice. And one of the people who proved that was still trapped in the ice when modern hikers arrived. On September 19, 1991, Helmut and Erika Simon were walking through the Ötztal Alps near the border of Austria and Italy. At about 10,500 feet, they saw something brown sticking out of the melting ice. They thought it was rubbish. Then they saw a human head and shoulders, dark skin stretched over bone. Everyone assumed the body belonged to a recent climber. The recovery was rough because the rescuers were not prepared for an archaeological discovery. It took days before dating showed the truth. The man had died roughly 5,300 years ago, before the pyramids, before Stonehenge, before written history in Europe. He was about 45 years old and just over 5 feet tall. His body carried more than 60 tattoos made by rubbing charcoal into small cuts. He had a copper axe, a flint dagger, a bow, arrows, and a wooden frame for carrying supplies. For years, researchers thought he had died from cold or exhaustion. Then new scans revealed a flint arrowhead lodged near his left shoulder. It had damaged an artery. He had bled to death. There was also a deep cut on his right hand, the kind of injury that can happen when someone tries to defend themselves. The man became known as Ötzi, and he is now widely described as Europe's oldest known murder victim. The mountains preserved the evidence, but they did not preserve the answer. We still do not know exactly who attacked him, why he was traveling alone, or whether he reached the high pass intentionally. There is a final, unsettling connection. In 2004, Helmut Simon, the modern hiker who found Ötzi, was caught in a blizzard in the same general mountain region. His body was later found under snow and ice. The person who brought the ancient dead man back into the world was taken by the same landscape. By then, Europe had spent several centuries teaching people to see those landscapes differently. The mountain rebrand began in the 18th century. European cities were filling with coal smoke, factories, noise, and strict working hours. The wealthy began looking for the opposite: clean air, open space, and places that made ordinary life feel small. Writers supplied the language. Thomas West published a guide to the English Lake District. Wordsworth and Coleridge turned walking through rough country into something thoughtful and respectable. The key word was sublime, a landscape so powerful that it frightened you and attracted you at the same time. Mountains were no longer only obstacles. They became experiences. By the 19th century, the experience had become a sport. British climbers founded the Alpine Club in London in 1857, the first mountaineering club of its kind. Between 1854 and 1865, many of the great alpine summits were climbed for the first time. The Golden Age ended on July 14, 1865. Edward Whymper led 7 men to the top of the Matterhorn, the last major unclimbed peak in the Alps. On the descent, the youngest member slipped. He struck the guide, Michel Croz, and the fall pulled 2 more climbers from the face. 4 men dropped thousands of feet. The rope connecting them to the survivors snapped. Whymper and 2 guides lived. 3 bodies were recovered. Lord Francis Douglas was never found. Almost immediately, people accused the survivors of cutting the rope. An inquiry cleared them, and later testing suggested the rope failed under the weight of the falling men. The accusation remained anyway. The broken rope is still displayed in a museum in Zermatt. The disaster made mountaineering more famous, not less. Newspapers carried the story across Europe. More people joined climbing clubs. More people traveled to the Alps. More people went higher, more often, with more confidence. That confidence had an unexpected side effect. Once enough people were alone on high ridges, they began reporting the same strange thing. Professor John Norman Collie was a chemist, a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, and one of the people who helped establish medical X-ray photography. He was also a serious climber, so when he described running from an invisible presence on Ben Macdui in Scotland, people paid attention. The incident had happened in 1891, but Collie told the story publicly decades later. He had been descending alone from the summit in thick mist. At first, he heard what sounded like footsteps behind him. The sound came again every few steps. He said the stride seemed 3 or 4 times longer than his own. He stopped. The sound stopped. He listened, saw nothing, and heard it again. Then he ran. Collie later said he staggered blindly for 4 or 5 miles, most of the way down toward the forest. He described something very queer about the top of the mountain and refused to return alone. Other climbers eventually wrote to him. They had felt a presence too, but had kept quiet because they expected to be mocked. The story gained a Gaelic name, Am Fear Liath Mór, the Big Grey Man. There are ordinary explanations. In the right conditions, a Brock inspector can project a person's own shadow onto mist and make it look huge. Wind moving through gullies can create low-frequency sound. Infrasound is too low for normal hearing, but it can still produce unease, pressure, or the feeling that something is nearby. Those explanations may account for some reports. They do not prove that every witness saw the same thing, and they do not make the fear unreal. A person alone on a mountain cannot simply switch off the body's warning system because the source is invisible. The Big Grey Man became possible as a story because more people were finally spending time alone in places that had once been avoided. But hiking was still unequal. Mountains might be beautiful now, yet access to them depended on who owned the land and who could afford the journey. That was about to change. 2 things turned hiking from an elite pastime into a public activity: protected land and marked paths. The United States helped establish the first model. Yellowstone became the world's first national park in 1872. Yosemite, Sequoia, and other protected areas followed. Instead of treating spectacular land as private property or raw material, governments began reserving it for public use. Conservation groups helped build the culture around those places. John Muir and others founded the Sierra Club in 1892. Scouts adopted hiking and helped create trails. Many new routes followed much older lines, indigenous paths, logging roads, and tracks beside streams. In 1921, forester Benton Mackay proposed a trail along the Appalachian chain. He imagined more than a long walk. His plan included farms, work camps, and places where people exhausted by city life could recover. The Appalachian Trail is what survived. Britain faced the opposite problem. Much of its best walking country was privately owned. Gamekeepers turned people away, and some landowners treated walkers as trespassers. Kinder Scout in the Peak District became known as Forbidden Ground. On April 24, 1932, A 20-year-old Manchester worker named Benny Rothman led a mass trespass onto the moor. The number of walkers is disputed. Reports range from about 100 to several thousand. Around 400 is often used as the most credible estimate. There were arguments and fights with gamekeepers. 6 men were arrested and 5 were jailed. The sentences created public sympathy instead of ending the protest. The campaign became part of the long movement for public access. National parks legislation followed in 1949, and the Pennine Way opened later. The trespass did not single-handedly create the right to roam, and historians still debate how much of the story has been simplified. But the direction was clear. Walking in wild country was becoming something governments had to recognize and organize. The United States built parks. Britain fought over paths. The Soviet Union built something else, a system that graded people by how much danger they could handle. The Soviet Union did not treat hiking as a casual weekend hobby. It treated it as a sport, a test, and a useful national activity. The system was called sport tourism. Hikers could earn a Tourist of the USSR badge and move through graded routes. In 1959, Grade 3 was the highest level. It required journeys of roughly 300 kilometers through remote terrain, with conditions difficult enough to demand real preparation. You did not simply announce that you were ready. A group submitted a route plan to a regional committee of physical, culture, and sport. A commission examined the route, the equipment, and the group's experience before approving the trip. Igor Dyatlov was 23 and studying radio engineering at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk. He led the institute's tourism section, built equipment himself, and trained groups for winter trips. His hikers carried extra weight in training, sometimes including heavy objects such as dumbbells or clothes irons. In January 1959, he assembled a team for a Grade 3 route in the northern Urals. Everyone began the trip with at least Grade 2 experience. Their target was Mount Otorten. The expedition was approved by the Route Commission and connected to the Komsomol and the coming party Congress. 10 people left Sverdlovsk on the 23rd of January. One of them, Yuri Yudin, turned back after a few days because of severe leg pain. That decision saved his life. The remaining 9 continued toward the mountain pass. They were trained, equipped, and operating inside a system built to prevent reckless trips. That is why what happened next became so difficult for people to accept. The official record did not describe a mistake. It described a force the hikers could not overcome. On the night of February 1st, 1959, the group pitched its tent on the exposed slope of Kholat Sayakla, a mountain whose name is often translated as Dead Mountain. There was a wooded valley more than a mile below, with better shelter. Instead, the hikers cut into the snow and made a level place for the tent. They may have chosen the slope to avoid losing height and time, or because the weather had already made the lower route difficult. Nobody heard from them again. The group was expected to return in early February, but Dyatlov had warned that the route might take longer. Families and the institute waited. By the 20th of February, they demanded a search. On the 26th of February, searchers found the tent. It was partly buried in snow and opened by cuts from the inside. Boots remained inside. So did coats and much of the group's equipment. Footprints led downhill toward the trees. Some people had socks. Some had one boot. Some were barefoot. The tracks did not look like a stampede, and there was no clear sign of an attacker chasing them. 2 bodies were found beneath a cedar tree beside the remains of a fire. Branches had been broken high up the trunk, suggesting that someone may have climbed it to look for the tent or judge the weather. 3 more bodies lay between the tree and the tent, as if they had tried to return. The final 4 were discovered in May beneath several meters of snow in a ravine. They had crushing injuries to the chest and skull, while the skin showed surprisingly little damage. One victim, Lyudmila Dubinina, was missing her tongue and eyes. Months in moving water can explain that kind of loss, but the detail helped turn the case into a permanent source of speculation. The 1959 investigation ended with a phrase that explained almost nothing. The hikers died because of a compelling natural force they could not overcome. The file was classified. That silence made every theory stronger. Weapons tests. Prisoners. A Yeti. The Mansi people, who were investigated and cleared. The more ordinary possibility, that snow, wind, darkness, and fear had combined, was treated as too simple for the story people wanted. For decades, the mountain kept the final explanation under snow. Then researchers returned to the slope with a computer model. In 2021, Swiss researchers Johann Gaume and Alexander Puzrin published a new explanation in Communications, Earth and Environment. They argued that the group may have been killed by a slab avalanche. Not the soft powder slide shown in films, but a hard block of wind-packed snow breaking loose above a weaker layer. The hikers had cut into the slope to make a flat platform for the tent. That did not mean the avalanche happened immediately. In the researchers' model, katabatic wind continued pushing new snow onto the slope for hours. The extra weight eventually became too much. When the slab released, it could have struck the tent with enough force to crush ribs and skulls. Because the snow was hard and compact, it could cause severe internal injuries without leaving dramatic wounds on the skin. The avalanche also explains the decision to leave quickly. If the tent was damaged or partly buried, the group may have believed another slide was coming. They cut their way out rather than searching for boots and coats in the dark. At the trees, they built a fire and tried to survive. Some may have climbed for a view of the slope. Others tried to return for supplies. Hypothermia, injury, and darkness then did the rest. The model answered several problems at once, but the researchers did not claim it explained every detail. The slope looked too shallow to many observers, and there were no obvious avalanche tracks by the time searchers arrived. Later fieldwork showed that the pass can produce avalanches, and the snow conditions could have hidden the evidence. The explanation was attacked by people who had spent decades protecting the mystery. That reaction is part of the story too. Once a disappearance becomes a legend, evidence is no longer competing only with other evidence. It is competing with identity, memory, and the feeling that an ordinary answer would insult the dead. Puzrin has argued that the avalanche protects the hiker's reputation rather than damaging it. The group was not foolish. A rare slab release could have surprised experienced mountaineers who had followed the correct procedures. The mountain did not need a monster to kill them. It only needed a chain of small decisions, made in a landscape where the margin for error was almost invisible. So the real question about hiking is not who climbed first, or whether the Dyatlov Pass case is finally solved. It is why we enter mountains now, when most of us do not need to cross them, work in them, or escape through them. For thousands of years, people went into high country because life required it. Ötzi carried tools because he had somewhere to be. Travelers crossed passes because the road went over them. Hunters and shepherds followed animals and seasons. Then writers changed the language. Mountains became sublime instead of hideous. A dangerous climb became a view. A path became a trail. A journey became a hobby, then a sport, then a public right. The landscape did not change when we began calling it beautiful. The weather still turns. Snow still moves after dark. A body can still disappear into ice and remain there for 5,000 years. What changed was our relationship with the risk. We began choosing it. That choice can produce wonder. It can lead to parks, friendships, stories, and a view that stays in the mind for the rest of a person's life. It can also produce the false confidence that comes from seeing a mountain as scenery instead of as a living system of rock, weather, snow, and distance. Somewhere right now, somebody is checking a weather window and deciding whether to go. Somewhere, a rescue team is driving toward a trailhead. And somewhere in Zermatt, a broken rope from 1865 sits behind glass while visitors prepare to climb the same mountain. If this is your kind of story, subscribe. There is another hidden history every week. And tell me in the comments, when you look at a mountain, do you see a view or a warning? Because hiking did not make the mountains harmless. It only taught us to walk toward the danger on purpose.